so much for turning out for what is an absolutely fabulous crowd for this presentation. Y'all really want to hear about women in the American Revolution. I'm part of Heritage Johnstown, and it's always such a pleasure to present presentations like this. We really value our partnership with the American Association of University Women, the Johnstown chapter. They have been bringing us really cool programs annually for years. And of course, it's Women's History Month, so we're really happy to have this one here. Want to call your attention to, there's some stuff here at the door about Heritage Johnstown and what we're doing, some stuff here about the AAUW and what they're doing. Encourage you to pick up that stuff. Encourage you to come back here to the Heritage Discovery Center for more programs. If you go to heritagejohnstown.org and click on events, you'll see all the exciting stuff coming up. And of course, we have our whole season of events coming up at People's Natural Gas Park too. But now, Madeline from AAUW is going to introduce Paul. Thank you.
As we recognize Women's History Month and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, tonight we will focus on voices in early American history that have been overlooked. Women were there, their stories matter, and this is the moment to hear them. The Johnstown branch of AAUW and the Heritage Discovery Center are very fortunate to have Dr. Paul Newman as our speaker tonight. Dr. Newman is a professor of early American history with particular expertise in the area around the American Revolution. He has taught at UPJ for 31 years, and I understand there are a number of his students here tonight. He has published several books. He has written many chapters, numerous journal articles and essays. He has functioned as an editor, a reviewer, and has presented at conferences. This is just a portion of Dr. Newman's academic achievements. He has been the recipient of a number of university-wide teaching awards, and in 2008, the History Channel named Dr. Newman the History Teacher of the Year. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Newman.
Is this thing on? Am I good? All right. Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, AAUW. And thank you, Dr. Valerie Grash, who reached out to me and asked me those many months ago if I'd be willing to do this. And I said, absolutely, I'd be happy to do it. And I am happy to be here. And happy Women's History Month. That's what we're here to celebrate and here to talk about. So really quickly, let me deal with the elephant in the room. I'm a historian coming here to talk to you about women's history. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I'm not a woman. I'm a man, product of women, a very strong mother who is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, who instilled in me a love of history, a woman who was involved in all sorts of political and social events throughout her life. She died at the age of 91 just 2 years ago. But she's a large part of why I'm here. I'm married to a very strong woman who's sitting up here in the front row, Anthony Winter. And she and I make a tremendous team, and she makes me a better person. And so, why am I here to talk to you about women's history? How do I have the authority to do that? Is this cultural or gender appropriation? I am an historian. I have been trained as a historian. I spent 10 years in college and in graduate school learning the trade of the craft of history. And what I learned to do there was to put aside my own biases, to work with evidence, to test evidence against itself, and to come up with valid conclusions and judgments about the past, whether I am of the same character of the people I study or not. So, I'm a scholar of the 18th century, particularly of colonial America. I'm not a colonist, and yet I do colonial history. My first book, my dissertation, was on German Americans and the American Revolution in the decades after. I'm not German, right? I right now do research and writing about American Indians and Indians in Pennsylvania. I'm not a Native American. I'm not an indigenous. I have been teaching women's history at UPJ. I taught it For the first decade I was there until we hired someone who was trained to teach that subject. She wanted to be here tonight, couldn't be here, Dr. Veronica Wilson. So I haven't taught it in about 15 or 20 years now, but I have taught it. I used to be a Commonwealth speaker for the state of Pennsylvania. One of the talks I did was Women and Work in American History. I was broadly trained as a social historian. So I'm not a woman, but I'm a product of women. I became a historian because of a woman. And this is what historians do. So, having that out of the way, let me start with a question. Name a famous woman from the American Revolution. Can you name one?
Anna Strong.
Tell me about Anna Strong.
Anna Strong was a spy for the Americans.
You're exactly right. And there were many women who served as spies. I didn't include her in today's talk, but I'm glad you brought her up, because that's one of many roles that women fulfilled in the military side of the war. Who's probably the most famous woman that most people would know? Oh, Betsy Ross. Oh, her. Right. Let's talk about Betsy Ross real quick. Betsy Ross was a real woman. She lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She was a seamstress. That is all that we know to be true about her. There is a claim that she made the flag with the 13 stars and the 13 stripes, and that she presented that flag to General George Washington in 1776. That claim was made 100 years later, in 1876, when Philadelphia was hosting the Centennial Exposition. It was like a World's Fair, but only U.S. exhibits were brought to Philadelphia to celebrate the centennial of the formation of the United States. It's 11 years after the end of the Civil War, so it was kind of a healing event, right? And so people came from all over the country to Philadelphia, and buildings like the Pennsylvania State House, they put that on tour, and they began calling it Independence Hall. And people learned about the Declaration of Independence, about the Constitution. Other buildings around the home of the house where Thomas Jefferson rented, where he wrote the Declaration, they gave tours of that. And so there was money to be made, a dime, a nickel here or there, of giving tours to these famous buildings. One of Betsy Ross's descendants lived in her house. And he got the idea that he could make some money touring the house. And so he created this story about his ancestor sewing this flag and presenting it to General Washington, and started giving tours for dimes for tourists coming in. That's how that story began. That's one of the myths of the American Revolution. But this is a kind of a safe story. This is why it becomes so popular. Betsy Ross is not a challenging woman to American history, to American men. She's fulfilling a woman's role. She's a seamstress. And she makes this patriotic flag, and she hands it over to a man, and there is women's role in the American Revolution. Right? So what we're here to do tonight is not to perpetuate myths, because if you want that, you can still go to Philadelphia and line up. Now you pay $25 to be told this lie. Right? I mean, you can still get that if you want it. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to try to go through some more of the realistic roles and the experiences of a wide range of American women. And I'm not just going to talk about women on the revolutionary side. By the end, we'll be talking about loyalists, because they made up 20% of the population, right? So we're not just going to talk about white women, of English stock. We'll talk about German women and women of other ethnicities. We're not just going to talk about white women. We'll talk about black women. We'll talk about Native American women, right? There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, hundreds of thousands, millions of women living in the United States that experience this American Revolution. So, my good friend Liam, if you would out in the lights for us, please. It's gonna get a little dark, but it's the only way we can really see these slides. So, before the revolutionary experience, we're talking up to about 1750, 1760, women had a very prescribed role in American life, in colonial life, but of course in the British world and the European world as well. This image from the middle of the 18th century tells women to keep within the compass, and you shall be sure to avoid any troubles where others might endure. Enter not into the way of the wicked, and go not down the path of evil men. And what is within the compass? Home, garden, domestic life. That was all that was available for women in the middle of the 18th century. English law regarding women was called the law of coverture, that women were covered by their men in all things legal and political. They had inherited that from the French, from the Norman invasion back in 1066. The French call it femme couvert, women covered. Women had no legal rights, no political rights at all. They were all subsumed into men, beginning with your father, then your husband, should he die, your brothers and your sons. No rights to property, no rights to representation, none whatsoever. This is an ironclad patriarchy on the eve of the American Revolution. But the American Revolution would begin to crack into the walls of that patriarchy. The experience would do this. How does it do it? What happens? Well, this revolution begins as a resistance movement against acts of Parliament in favor of British constitutional rights. And those British constitutional rights, by the time we get into the late 18th century, were based in natural rights philosophy. The theories of John Locke and his contract theory of government, and the philosophers like Montesquieu and Rousseau and David Hume, all who are writing that there are human rights that are innate, that are natural, that come from the state of nature, that people carry with them. These are powerful ideas that make up the Enlightenment. And as Great Britain, as Parliament was passing new taxes for the purpose of raising revenue to pay the enormous debt from the French and Indian War, Americans began to recoil and to say that their constitutional rights were being violated. What are among these rights? The right to have representation from a government that takes tax money from you. That to be taxed without representation is robbery. During the course of this period, they were also passing new regulations in order to regulate trade, to bring more money into the empire, to pay those debts. Those regulations would lead to legislation, laws, passed without American representation. If you are forced to do things against your will and you have no representative authority giving the permission, that's an arbitrary power. Americans began calling that slavery. And so this kind of language is being used when they're opposing the proclamation of 1763 that closed off the West from any colonial expansion. When they're opposing the Sugar Act or the Molasses Act of 1764 that brought new customs officials into searching their stores and searching their ships without search warrants, which is something that was a violation of the British Constitution, using what were called writs of assistance that simply came from Parliament that said that they had the right to search any ship and any house they wanted. These were things that violated their natural rights, and you saw people complaining about that. And then the Stamp Act, a tax on paper, that brought in money just to go directly to the British Parliament. It wasn't a customs duty. They've been paying those for 100 years, right? Those were things that helped their trade and made them wealthy. This was a tax that was just sending money to Parliament that was going to be spent without their consent, stealing from them, right? So all of this, people complain using the logic and the language of natural rights. And people who weren't male and white heard these words. They understood what was being said. This fight against or resistance to arbitrary power, that was something that the enslaved heard. And they would demand change from their enslavers. That was something that Indians heard. And they would demand an end to this from their displacers. And of course, that was something that mistresses heard and demanded an end to patriarchal arbitrary power by their masters, women, right? So by the time we get to 1774, you go through 11 years of this, and I'll go back through it really quickly. You do get to sentiments like these. This is Sarah J. She is the wife of the secretary of the New York Committee of Correspondence in 1774. All the colonies had created these committees in order to try to work against the intolerable acts. The Tea Act, Massachusetts Government Act, the fact that the British had been putting troops into Boston that year. So her husband was John Jay. John Jay would later be a Supreme Court justice in the 1790s. In the 1780s, he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, creating the U.S. Constitution. She says to him in 1774 in a letter, "I've transgressed the line that I proposed to observe in my correspondence by slipping into politics, but my country and my friends possess so entirely my thoughts that you must not wonder if my pen runs beyond the dictates of prudence." So here she is, just a few years before, was one of these women who's been told to stay within the compass. And she is telling her husband, "I am moving beyond this compass, and you will hear me. And I'm going to speak my mind about these politics." So if we go back and look, you can go back to 1765, and you can see New Yorkers burning stamped paper on Wall Street. And in the crowd, you see wealthy people, right, dressed with their fine tricorn hats, but then you see farmers, and then you see craftsmen. You see white people, and you see African Americans. You see men, and you see women. They're participating in this resistance movement, and they're inculcating the ideas of natural rights. By 1767, the British try a series of new taxes called the Townshend duties. And primarily, they're taxes on silk, on linen, on ready-made clothing, on the dyes that are used to make that clothing. They're all coming from Britain. The men in 1765, working against the Stamp Act, had formed an organization called the Sons of Liberty, which they would go out and they would enforce their own rules against these taxes, breaking down the houses sometimes of taxmen. In 1767, women would form their own organization that they called the Daughters of Liberty. What you see them doing here is engaging in what's called a spinning bee. So the Sons of Liberty have announced a number of edicts in every colony saying that they refused to allow the importation of any of the goods that were on the Townshend duty list. That included all these clothing items, but also lead and glass, paint, tea, carpet, all sorts of things, to make sure those things would not come in and they could not be sold. So the tax couldn't be collected. Well, what these women are doing is they're taking local fibers, mostly flax and hemp. Yes, hemp. Not that hemp, right? Same plant, right? But you grow it in such a way, kind of like plant it like corn, so it gets very stalky, the stalk gets big, and it's the fibers from the stalk that you take to make rope, right? That makes the British and the American shipping industry go. Well, here they were taking hemp fibers and flax fibers, and it wasn't just spinning, but you start with carding, right? Getting the fibers ready to be spun, and then spinning, and then weaving into a product that they called homespun. This was being done in every single colony. That homespun would be a very natural color. They weren't importing the dyes to dye it, and so it kind of looked like khaki. And they would make clothing, dresses and blouses and jackets and shirts and pants, and it became the uniform of resistance. The Sons of Liberty would go about the cities making sure that everyone was wearing homespun. And if you dared to wear silk or linen, whether you bought it before the boycotts or not, they would strip you in the city streets, right? And humiliate you publicly. And so these women's organizations played a big role in this. The Pennsylvania Chronicle was a newspaper from Philadelphia. And on Christmas Day of 1768, Hannah Griffiths was a daughter of liberty, and she submitted and wrote a poem called The Female Patriots. And I'm going to read you a very small piece of this. Since the men, from a party or fear of a frown, are kept by a sugar plum quietly down, supinely asleep and deprived of their sight, are stripped of their freedom and robbed of their right, if the sons, so degenerate, the blessing despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise. And though we've no voice, but a negative here, the use of the taxables, let us forbear. Right? So this wonderful poem that kind of announces the power of the daughters of liberty. In 1773, the British passed a tax called the Tea Act that actually lowered the tax on tea. But they did that because they were taking away choice from the American consumer, from having 3 companies to buy tea from down to 1, the British East India Company that was failing. And so they were propping up this company by giving them the entire American market. If the Parliament can do that, and remember, the colonies don't produce finished products. They're not allowed to by law. If they can withhold, right, make you a slave to this one British company, they can do it with other British companies. And so this concept of they're enslaving us comes. Well, you get tea parties, and Boston is the biggest one, right? The Boston Tea Party, where a number of the Sons of Liberty will disguise themselves as Indians, go on board the British East India Company ship, and throw the tea into the harbor. Why did they disguise themselves as Indians? It wasn't a disguise. What it was is they were making a political point. The same time that the Tea Act comes out, there's the announcement of the coming of the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act creates a new colony that stretches from today's Quebec through Ontario all the way down into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The area south of the lakes by the Quebec Act was said to be off limits forever to white settlement from the American colonies, that it would forever be an Indian reserve. And so they're combining the two things here, saying that you love the Indians more than you love us, right? Well, you had the big tea party in Boston, but every single city from Boston southward and cities northward that had ports also had tea parties. They didn't have to throw tea in other harbors because they were able to warn British ship captains that if they tried to bring their tea in, they would destroy it. And so the British ships just stayed out. So there's tea parties everywhere, including Edenton, North Carolina, which was one that was led by women, 52 of them. And they would publish in the newspaper their resolution and then send it to Parliament in England. And what they say, and I've got it here, this is out of the newspaper. These are the 52 women who signed it. Whereas the provincial deputies of North Carolina, having resolved not to drink any more tea, nor wear any more British cloth, etc., many ladies of this province have determined to give a memorable proof of their patriotism and have accordingly entered into the following honorable and spirited association. I send it to you to show you, fair countrywomen in England, how zealously and faithfully American ladies follow the laudable example of their husbands, and what opposition your matchless ministers may expect to receive from a people thus firmly united against them. And whereas, as we cannot be indifferent on any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country, it is a duty which we owe to ourselves to do everything as far as lies in our power to testify our sincere adherence to the same. And we do therefore accordingly ascribe this paper as a witness of our fixed intention and solemn determination. Therefore, we, the undersigned, pledge to forego consumption of English goods until all acts tending to enslave our native country are repealed. And that was sent off to London. When it gets there, English newspapers reprint it, and they begin to laugh at these colonists who allow their women to make political statements. And this is a political cartoon that lampoons these women, right? Making them out to be men, right? And women that are being having things suggested to them by men, when this isn't the case at all. These women are acting on their own, and they know very well what they're doing. The president of their organization is Penelope Barker. When she sends this thing off to her local newspaper, she quotes that maybe it's only been men who have protested the king up to now. That only means we women have taken too long to let our voices be heard. We are signing our names to a document, not hiding ourselves behind costumes like the men in Boston did at their Tea Party. The British will know who we are, and they signed their names. Right? So this is before the Declaration of Independence. It has all the signatures that go off. This is the Edenton Ladies' Tea Party in 1773. Another example, as we're coming still before the war, is Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams. You probably know him. John Adams was a member of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. He'd later serve as an ambassador to England, and then he serves as the first vice president of the United States and later president at the end of the 18th century. Well, on March 31st, 1776, John had left Braintree, Massachusetts to head to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, and he went there hoping that they'd be able to push their way towards a vote on independence. On March 31st, Abigail writes to him, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it'll be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." 2 weeks later, on April 14th, John writes back to Abigail, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, oh my, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and more powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out." 3 weeks later, it only takes 2 weeks for the mail to travel. 3 weeks later, she writes back, "I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies. For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard. They are very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power to not only free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet." Man, she does not let him off easy here. And just a little bit more, I didn't read it to you, but John read this letter at the Continental Congress to some people, including Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson's reaction after laughing was that women shouldn't wrinkle their pretty brows over matters of politics. So that's your Thomas Jefferson. All right. So, you get women like Abigail Adams. Let's go down to the other end of the spectrum, to women like Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley was born a free little girl in West Africa, and she was taken into slavery and sold to colonial Massachusetts in the 1760s as a child. Her master ended up selling her to a man by the name of John Wheatley. John Wheatley freed Phyllis, educated her, treated her as one of his daughters. And in 1773, she published her first book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral by Phyllis Wheatley, published in London, no less. One of her poems was titled On Tyranny and Slavery. Americans have been talking a lot about being enslaved to Parliament in the British Empire. Well, here she's going to say something about that. No more, America, in mournful strain, of wrongs and grievances unredressed complain. No longer shalt thou dread the iron chain, which wanton tyranny with lawless hand had made, and with it meant to enslave the land. Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung? Whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood? I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Africa's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled, stolen, steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? And this is published in London, right? So she's talking about the tyranny that Americans are facing, but also the tyranny that they're creating at the same time. And so African Americans would follow this. So you would see at the commencement of the war, there are 400,000 enslaved people. There are 450,000 African American people living in the colonies. 400,000 of them are enslaved. During the course of the war, the British would rely on these loyalists to help them fight. In 1779, the British come out with the Philipsburg Proclamation that offers freedom to any enslaved person who runs away to British lines and will serve with the British Army. 80,000 from South Carolina alone do this. And it's not just men. Men and women, boys and girls will join up with the British Army. Men will be outfitted in uniforms and will be given guns. Women will serve behind the lines with the British Army. And they will serve as a quartermaster corps. They'll serve as teamsters. They will cook. They'll do laundry. They'll do anything to fight for their freedom by joining the British as loyalists. How many total? We think at least 120,000, looking at the other colonies, states, maybe as many as 150 out of 400,000, which makes the American Revolution the largest slave rebellion that the world had ever seen by this time. And women were about half of those numbers, and children. After, or during the Revolution, I should say, other women, like Elizabeth, who is known affectionately by her family and friends as Mum Bet, right? Bet, Beth for Elizabeth. In 1780 in Massachusetts, as an enslaved woman, she gets the help of some abolitionists in Massachusetts, and she sues for her freedom using the Massachusetts Constitution, which is full of language of natural rights. She sues for her freedom, loses it, appeals to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. The Supreme Court grants her freedom and strikes down slavery, abolishes it immediately in the entire state of Massachusetts. And it's the first place in the United States where slavery is completely abolished. That was 2 years after Pennsylvania passed the first law, gradually abolishing slavery, only freeing people who were under the age of 28 years old by the time they reached their 28th birthday. So it would take 2 or 3 generations before slavery ends in Pennsylvania in the 1840s. Massachusetts is able to do it right away. Why? Because of Mum Bet, who takes a name. She had the last name of her master, which I'm not going to utter. She takes a new last name, Freeman. Right? This is a common name in the United States among African Americans because many in the 18th and 19th century, upon getting freedom, would get rid of their slave name, their master's name, and choose a name like Freeman. So, what about Native women? And here we're going to move from the period of resistance through the war, because it's not just the resistance period that is politicizing women, but the war itself politicizes them. What you're seeing here on the screen behind me is an image from New York, where women of the Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca tribes, who you know as the Iroquois Confederation or the Haudenosaunee League, faced down General John Sullivan and his troops who came in 1779. Sullivan had been sent to New York by General Washington. And Washington had given him an order, and here is what it is. This expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against hostile tribes of the Six Nation of Indians. The immediate object is their total destruction and devastation, and the capture of as many persons of every age and sex as possible. It'll be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and to prevent their planting more. Do it in the most effectual manner, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. And here he leaves his beautiful cursive, and Washington had incredible penmanship, and goes to print in all capital letters, destroyed. He ordered Sullivan to take along with him wagons of salt. So after they burned their crops, to salt the ground so they couldn't return to it and farm on it again. This is an order of ethnic cleansing. You will not by any means listen to overtures of peace before the total destruction of their settlements is effected. 40 villages out of 60 were destroyed, all homes, all crops. The Seneca had to retreat to Niagara, followed by the Cayugas. The Onondagas moved across Lake Erie into Ontario. And so too did the Oneidas, which I'll talk about in just a second. One Onondaga chief wrote about this experience that really contradicted what you heard from General Washington's orders. Washington ordered the capture of as many persons of every age and sex as possible. This Onondaga chief said, "They put to death all the women and children, excepting some of the young women, whom they carried away for the use of their soldiers, and were afterwards put to death in a more shameful manner." Sullivan didn't give an order for his troops to rape Indian women, but he knew it was going on and made no attempt to stop it or to their murder. This is a war crime. People find out about this war crime. And later, when the United States will capture a British general who they were accusing of paying Indians to scalp and murder civilians, George Washington has to order that that general be paroled and not tried so that Washington himself could protect himself and General Sullivan from the same fate. Right? So this is what's happening to Native women, as you can see, and their families. But they take a role themselves. Now, like I said, Oneida women were focused on here, and yet the Oneidas were the only Indian tribe east of the Mississippi in the north who were allied with the United States. And yet they get attacked as well. Just 6 months earlier, the woman you see here her name is Polly Cooper, is an Oneida woman who led 47 other Oneida and Seneca women with 250 bushels of corn to take to Valley Forge to feed American soldiers. And when Washington there at Valley Forge offered to pay them, they refused payment. 6 months later, the Oneidas will end up being moved out of New York with those other Indians of the Confederation. Just absolutely amazing. Another Indian woman looking farther south who deserves a nod here is Nanyehi, her English name Nancy Ward. She was a Cherokee leader, political leader. The thing you have to understand about the Cherokee is from the beginning of their people through the 18th century, they were not just matrilineal, but they were matriarchal. The women were the political leaders. And it would be Nanyehi, who would go to Tennessee in 1781 and sue for peace with the American General John Sevier. And she would create a peace there that would last for more than 50 years, guaranteeing the Cherokee, right, survival for another 5 decades until Indian removal and the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. But this is a real feat, right? That's something that the American men didn't understand. When she came, like, where are your men? Like, I am the man, right? I am here to make this treaty. And so that's Nancy Ward, Nanyehi. Now, as we look at the battlefront, and the Indians are a good transition, and so we're African Americans, because many American women are going to be experiencing this war at the battlefront, working with the Army. You've probably heard the term camp followers before. And so there were a lot of women that were doing this. Why? Because the United States, Army, they had about, there's 2 million white Americans in the 1770s. 20% of them, 400,000, are loyalists. Then you've got about 40%, about 800,000 that are committed patriots. And then you got another 40% who are in the middle. They're neutrals. They're licking their finger, put it on the air, which way is the wind blowing today, right? Trying to figure out what they should do in the midst of this war, right? Which is a civil war as well as a revolution. It's Americans fighting Americans. So you get this incredible, problem of moving this army. You've got maybe 200,000 men from 75 to 83 who serve with the Continental Army and with the various state militias combined. All of those men, right, at all times as the armies are needed to fight. They don't have enough men at any one time to really fulfill a commissary or a quartermaster corps. It's going to be camp followers, women who are going to be going along doing these jobs, right? In ancient history, camp followers get a bad name, right? They get accused of prostitution, things like that. Here in the American Revolution, right, these women were integral, right, to the success of armies on both sides, for the British and for the Americans. Let's talk about some of them and the kind of roles they played. So this is one of the most famous ones. So if I'd ask you for another famous American woman, anybody know who this one is? Molly Pitcher, exactly. You know what her name was? That's her nickname. Mary Ludwig Hayes, right? So German-American woman who went along with the army with her husband. So her husband was going out to fight. She said, you're not going to leave me here. I'm going along with you, right? And she went, as did thousands of women. And what she did is she took a position as a camp follower where she would cook and clean for a mess of soldiers and make sure that they had clean clothes, make sure that they had food, right? All that kind of thing. She was with her husband and the army at the Battle of Monmouth in the summer of 1778, coming out of Valley Forge. She spent the winter at Valley Forge. And she was there when her husband was hit by enemy fire. Her husband was a wadder on the cannon team. And so in this picture, you can see his knees here. He's fallen down. She jumped in, grabbed his wadder, and ran that cannon for the rest of the day. She was so familiar with the job her husband did. Here she is, right, stepping from camp follower into the position of soldier. So what about that nickname, Molly Pitcher? This is as important or maybe more important than her service here at Monmouth, because she served for years, saw several battles. And what she did on the battlefield that got her that nickname, Molly, of course, is a nickname for Mary, Pitcher. While battles were going on, while the fighting, the bullets are flying, and men are falling and getting hit, laying on the battlefield, many are getting wounded with these wounds, anywhere from their chests down to their bellies, and they're dying from bleeding, right? They're bleeding out. When you bleed to death, right, when men are bleeding to death on battlefields, they start with this unbelievable thirst, right, that is just painful, and they cry out for water. They're going to die. There's nothing you can do for a wound to the belly or the chest, right? She would fill pitchers of water and run out onto the battlefield while the bullets were flying to give comfort to dying soldiers, right? That's a lot of bravery, right? That takes a lot of guts, and that's why she's so revered among soldiers. So that's a camp follower. She isn't paid for this. She's completely volunteer. Most of the women that went with the armies were. Not this one. This is Sarah Osborne Benjamin. And she was a retainer to the army. So what that meant is for about every regiment, which is about 1,000 soldiers, the Continental Army would agree to hire and take into the army and give army pay and the rank of corporal with 1 stripe to about 6 to 8 of these female retainers. And so this is Sarah Osborne Benjamin. She's one of these retainers. She's part of the army. And what her job is to do is to organize all of these volunteer camp followers and to make sure that this is a good unit, right? That somebody's driving the wagons, that somebody's bringing in the food, that the laundry's getting done, that the cooking's happening, that all of those things happening. And that's what these women did. Now, Sarah Osborne, she was part of the army, and so the United States government passed a couple of different pensions for army veterans. And so she applied for one of these pensions. And when she applied, she had to take a deposition and to give her story. I'm going to read you a very small part of her story, but a very important one. So she is, in this, is referred to as deponent, right? So she's being deposed. They, meaning the army, however, marched in immediately for a place called Williamsburg, as she thinks, deponent, alternately on horseback and on foot. Then they marched for Yorktown. And then they reached the place of encampment about 1 mile from Yorktown. This is in Virginia, 1781. Deponent was on foot, and the other females above named and her said husband still on the commissary's guard. The deponent took her stand just back of the American tent, say about 1 mile from the town, and busied herself washing, mending, and cooking for the soldiers, in which she was assisted by the other women. Some men washed their own clothing. I like how she adds that. She heard the roar of the artillery for a number of days. And the last night, the Americans threw up entrenchments. The deponent's husband was there throwing up entrenchments, and the deponent cooked and carried in beef and bread and coffee in a gallon pot to the soldiers in the entrenchment. So what's going on? There's a fort at Yorktown. General Cornwallis is there, and he's holed up in this fort with his entire army. And he is surrounded by thousands of American and French soldiers and hundreds of these women, right there along with the army. And every day they're digging trenches, they're putting the mortars up in the new trenches, they're firing in under the cover of darkness, they dig new trenches closer and they keep moving closer and closer. Meanwhile, Cornwallis is firing back at them constantly. When she and the other women are taking gallons of coffee and food and clean laundry and clean socks into these men, they are dodging bullets. They're being fired on. So, on one occasion, when deponent was thus employed, carrying in provisions, she met General Washington, who asked her, quote, if she was not afraid of the cannonballs. She replied, no, the bullets will not cheat the gallows. It would not do for the men to fight and starve too. Here's George Washington treating her like a child, and she answers him like a grown woman. That, no, I am as much of a soldier as you are. The bullets won't cheat the gallows. I'm as much of a traitor to the English cause as you are, right? It won't do for the men to fight and starve too. Incredible, right? Stands right up to him. This is the effect of the resistance movement and the American Revolution. It is loosening the bands of deference that had tied powerless people to powerful ones. And so you can hear this language. The revolution is not just a war, right? It's not just something that gives Americans home rule from British overseers and overlords. It's something that creates within the hearts of people the desire for equality, the desire for representation, the love of democracy. And you can hear that in the words of Sarah Osborne Benjamin, who at the age of 83 did get her pension. And she lived to the ripe old age of 109, right? Absolutely amazing. And then there's the experience of other women like Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson decided that she didn't want to be a camp follower. She was not interested in being a retainer. She wanted to be a soldier. But that was something that wasn't allowed in the 1770s. Today, women can serve, right? In wartime, they can serve in infantry. They're getting battlefront experience today, but not in the 1770s. She wanted to join, so she signed up for a troop, a Massachusetts infantry regiment in 1781, and she took the name Timothy Thayer. She bound her breasts, right? Cut her hair short, put on men's clothing, and she mustered in. And they gave her a signing bonus. And so she had that, was working on this, and when somebody found her out and pointed out that she wasn't who she said she was, she paid back her bonus, right? Wasn't charged with a crime, went on her way, and a few months later, tried it again, right? This time, instead of going with just a Massachusetts infantry unit, she joined a light infantry company. That's special forces. She did that because many women have been trying to get into these infantry units, and some of them successfully. She's not the only one. There are many others. And so in those infantry units, they started really looking and inspecting women to see, right, are you really a man, right? But in the light infantry, hey, no way, right? She goes right in. So she's in this special forces unit. She takes the name this time, Robert Shirtleff. You get it, right? So in the 18th century, the double F, whenever you see it in print, means the double S. Printers, the number one letter used in the English language is the letter S, and so printers would run out of S's pretty quickly, and so they would always substitute two F's for the S because they looked very similar in script. So she took the name Robert Shirtless. That if she was ever go shirtless, she'd be exposed and she would be run out of the army. So she joins in 1782. She starts seeing combat. She fights and is wounded at the Battle of Tarrytown, where she takes a saber wound to the forehead and she takes a musket ball to her thigh. She argues with her fellow soldiers not to take her to the surgeon's tent, but they get her there anyway. The surgeon attends to her saber wound in her forehead, and she slips out of there before they can take off her pants, right? She goes back behind the lines, finds a place behind a tree, pulls out her sewing needle. Every soldier had a sewing kit. So a long sewing needle and her penknife, and digs this musket ball out of her own thigh. Bandages herself up, goes back to the line so that she's not caught, and continues to fight, right? So, badass Deborah Sampson, right? So, the next year, in the summer of 1783, the war is dragging to an end, but the peace hasn't been signed. That summer, she's with her unit in Philadelphia, where she gets sick. She gets some kind of illness, some sort of fever. She goes to sick bay, and she passes out. When she passes out, the doctor treating her starts to undress her to try to put ice on her, what have you, and discovers her, that she's been binding her breasts. But he doesn't turn her in. He keeps her secret for several months until the Treaty of Paris is signed. And then what he does is he writes a letter, right, because he gets to know her, knows her whole story, commending her, and sends this letter and her to General Henry Knox. And when she gets there, Knox opens the letter. He's like, wow, you did all these great things, and oh, you're a woman. Knox gives her an honorable discharge, not a dishonorable one. And because of that, she's able to get not one, not two, but 3 different pension applications through in the late 18th and the 19th century. A writer interviews her by the name of Herman Mann and writes a book in 1797, The Female Review, The Life of Deborah Sampson, the Female Soldier in the War of the Revolution. The Female Soldier. There were many others. Many, many others. But that book is a sensation. By 1802, she goes on a speaking tour throughout the United States, and she does this to raise money for herself, but also to make a point. And so what she does in her speaking tour is it's in two parts. So the first part, she comes out and gives this long speech about how women should know their place. And then she leaves the stage, goes behind, puts on a revolutionary uniform, grabs her musket, comes out and does a drill and shows them what a soldier does. And all of the women in the audience got the joke, right? That was her place, right? Know your place. Your place is with the men. Your place is doing things that men do. So, women are serving in these ways. Women on the home front are serving too. They're doing things like taking over farms in place of their men who are going out to fight. Remember, 230,000 or so, 230,000 men fighting for the revolutionaries, about 60,000 fighting with the loyalists, right? So huge numbers, which means that men who are leaving farms, men who are leaving blacksmith shops, men who are leaving shoemakers' shops and coopers' shops, their wives and daughters and sisters are stepping in to run those things. And that's happening all over. And before the war, that's something that had never been seen in these colonies. You know, the French and Indian War was not a huge thing in these colonies. You had a few thousand men that were involved. This is hundreds of thousands, up to 300,000. You talk about the African-American experience, you're talking over 400, almost 500,000 American men in a population of 2.5 million total. So that's a lot, right? 1 in 5. And so women have to do that. But not only those kinds of duties, women also start to take care of their communities. So in Boston, there is the Orphan Asylum Society that gets started because there's so many children that are being left orphaned by the war that the women of Boston start to go out and raise money in the public, giving speeches, going door to door, collecting money, things women had never done before in order to take care of these children. New York had a women's society for the relief of widows and orphans. Philadelphia had the Philadelphia Ladies Association. The president was this woman, Esther de Beard Reed of Philadelphia. And what she proposed to do was to organize the women of the city to raise money to buy supplies for the Continental Army in 1778 and 1779. And to tell the Philadelphia community that they were going to do this, she writes a broadside called The Sentiments of an American Woman, publishes it anonymously, American Woman, but we know it's her. And what she says is this: on the commencement of actual war, women of America manifested a firm resolution to contribute as much as could be depended upon them to the deliverance of their country. Our ambition is kindled by the same of those heroines of antiquity who have rendered their sex illustrious and have proved to the universe that if the weakness of our Constitution, if opinion and manners did not forbid us to march to glory by the same paths as the men, we should at least equal and sometimes surpass them in our love for the public good. So many famous sieges where women have been seen forgetting the weakness of their sex, building new walls, digging trenches with their feeble hands, furnishing arms to their defenders. They themselves darting the missile weapons on the enemy, resigning the ornaments of their apparel and their fortune to fill the public treasury and to hasten the deliverance of their country, burying themselves under its ruins, throwing themselves into the flames rather than submit to the disgrace of humiliation before a proud enemy. Born for liberty, disdaining to bear the irons of a tyrannic government, we associate ourselves to the grandeur of those who have extended the empire of liberty and contented to reign by sweetness and justice, have broken the chains of slavery forged by tyrants in the times of ignorance and barbarity. Who amongst us will not renounce with the highest pleasure those vain ornaments when she shall consider that the valiant defenders of America will be able to draw some advantage from the money which she may have laid out in these, that these presents will perhaps be valued by them at a greater price when they will have it in their power to say, this is the offering of the ladies. And they raised, by going door to door, they divided the city up into 10 districts. There's almost 100 women in this association, and there's about 7 or 8 or 9 per district. and go door to door asking for donations, which was not something that women would have ever done just a decade before. Going out in public and organizing this way, they raised over $70,000 in Continental money, over $7,500 in gold coin, when gold coin was incredibly dear. That's the power. And they bought thousands of shirts with that money to give to the Continental Army. So, powerful, powerful indeed. So these women, right, all of them working together on the home front, are doing the part that they feel they need to for this fight for natural rights. And not just the natural rights of their men, but of themselves. And so you'll get women who will be among the most ardent of promoters of this fight for natural rights and democratic rights. Women like Mercy Otis Warren, who, when the war was going on, began to take notes. She saved newspaper clippings and began to hold together a history of the revolution. By 1803, she would publish a book, The History of the Rise and Progress and Termination of the American Revolution. The very first history of this event was written by a woman. Her husband, Joseph Warren, died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. This meant something to her. And then you get women like Judith Sargent Murray, who by 1790 will reap the benefits of these women. It's by 1790 that you begin to see public education of girls in the United States. Without the revolution, that wouldn't be happening in 1790. But here is what Judith Sargent Murray writes in the Massachusetts Magazine in March of 1790 in her poem on the equality of the sexes, and this regards education. So she says, that minds are not alike full well I know. This truth each day's experience will show. Some there are who wish not to improve, who never can the path of knowledge love, whose souls almost with the dull body one, with anxious care each mental pleasure shun. While others, emulous of sweet applause, industrious seek for each event a cause, tracing the hidden springs where knowledge flows, which nature all in beauteous order shows. Yet, cannot I their sentiments imbibe, who this distinction to the sex inscribe? As if a woman's form must needs enroll a weak, a servile, inferior soul, and that the guise of man must still proclaim greatness of mind, and him to be the same? But imbecility is still confined, and by the lordly sex to us consigned, they rob us of the power to improve, and then declare that we only trifles love. Yet haste the era when the world shall know that such distinctions only dwell below. The soul unfettered, to no sex confined, was for the abodes of cloudless day designed. Meantime, we emulate their manly fires. Through erudition, all their thoughts inspires. Yet nature with equality imparts, and noble passions swell even female hearts. And so by the time you get to the 19th century, women's public education has become normal. Textbooks are being written for women on grammar, on history, on literature, philosophy, mathematics. Women start to engage in education because of this. The women who had been educated before had been educated by their fathers through private tutors. Average girls are going to become educated now because of all of this. And then there are other women. There were women who didn't choose the winning side. Women who were wives and daughters and sisters and aunts of loyalists. They were loyalists themselves. What does it mean to be a loyalist? Well, these loyalists from 1763 to 1775 had been part of the resistance movement. They were interested in natural rights. They were interested in the rights of colonists vis-a-vis the Parliament. It's just when the United States divided itself from Great Britain and figuratively committed regicide, cutting off the head of the king with the Declaration of Independence, that was a step too far for them. And yet these women were a part of the same struggle. And so you would see this war become a civil war, with Americans fighting Americans, and American loyalist women would face all sorts of trials and travails at the hands of revolutionaries. This woman certainly did. This is Sarah Logan Fisher. Her husband, first of all, her father was a very well-established Pennsylvania merchant. Her husband was also a merchant. So she's from a privileged class. And we have her diary. Now, she lived in Philadelphia. I'm going to read you a few diary entries from the first beginning in November of 1776 and then going through the British occupation of the city, which was something that she cheered on. November 30th, 1776. I heard that the English had possession of Newark. 8 men, by the order of the Committee of Safety, came to my house for blankets. They took 2 by force. December 27th, 1776. This morning I heard an account of the success of the American army against the English at Trenton on Christmas night, which was very stormy. Report says that General Washington crossed the river full of ice the day before and the head of a large body of his army and surprised the Hessians and English the day after. That there was not a sufficient number there to oppose them and that they surrendered about 700 prisoners, some with cannon, 1,000 stand of arms. This piece of news greatly elated our Whigs, patriots in the city of Philadelphia, and as much depressed we Tories, but I sincerely hope and believe that before long General Howe will subdue their rebellious spirit and give them but little reason to rejoice. January 4th, a few weeks later, 1777. This evening a paper came out from the Committee of Safety, unlike any I ever heard before, except of the Spanish Inquisition, declaring that every person who refused the Continental money should be liable for the first offense to forfeit their goods and a sum of equal value, and for the second offense to be banished from what they are pleased to call this state, quote unquote. A most extraordinary instance of arbitrary power. And of the quote-unquote liberty that we shall enjoy should their government ever be established. A tyrannical government, it will prove, from weak and wicked men. And so this is a loyalist woman who's talking about natural rights, right, and about arbitrary power being used by the Pennsylvania government against her and her husband. September 2nd, 9 months later, the chickens come home to roost. An affecting, trying scene presented itself this day for our further refinement, as we are told it is through suffering that we are to be made perfect. At about 11 o'clock, our new-made council sent some of their deputies to many of the inhabitants whom they suspected of Toryism, and without any regular warrant or written paper mentioning their crime, no warrant, or telling them of it in any way, committed them to confinement. And among their number, 21, was my own dear husband. 3 men came for him and offered him his parole if he would confine himself prisoner to our own house, which he refused to sign. They then told him he must go with them and be confined. He refused going until he had seen the warrant, upon which they read over a paper which they called one. He was taken prisoner and removed from Pennsylvania and taken to Charlottesville, Virginia, where he'd spend the rest of the war, separated from her. And she would have to find her way through this. September 26th, a few days later, General Howe's army was on its way to Philadelphia to take over the city. And that morning she rose very early in hopes of seeing a most pleasing sight. And about 10 a.m. the British troops began to enter. First came the light horse, nearly 200 I imagine in number, clean dress, and their bright swords glittering in the sun. After that came the foot, headed by Lord Cornwallis. Before him went a band of music, which played a solemn tune, which I afterwards understood was called God Save Great George Our King. Then followed the soldiers, who looked very clean and healthy, and a remarkable solidity was on their countenance. No wanton levity or indecent mirth, but a gravity well becoming the occasion seemed on all their faces. Thus was this large city surrendered to the English without the least opposition whatever, or even firing a single gun. 10 months later, June 18th, 1778. This morning about 6, the grenadiers and light infantry left us, and in less than a quarter hour, the Americans were in the city. Judge, any impartial person, what were my feelings at that time. And that was the end of her diary. Then you've got a neighbor of hers, Grace Groden Galloway. I'm only going to read one piece of her diary, but it says a lot. Tuesday, the 21st of July, 1778. So this is now a month after the British have abandoned Philadelphia. Was in very good spirits. Sukey Jones came in the morning to tell me that the men, agents entrusted with the disposal of confiscated estates, because that's what the Pennsylvania government was doing, was now confiscating the estates, the property, the houses, everything of loyalists. That they were at Shoemaker's yesterday, Samuel Shoemaker. He had supported the British cause. And he had been jailed like her husband, Joseph Galloway. Galloway had been a member of the Continental Congress in 1775 and 76, now a loyalist. Mrs. Jones was here about 2 o'clock, and they came. One Smith, and a hatter, and Colonel Will, and one Schreiner, and a Dutchman, I know not his name. And they all took an inventory of everything in my house, even down to the broken china and empty bottles. I had such spirits that I appeared not uneasy. She was pissed. I was fighting with them. They told me they must advertise the house for sale, right, to raise money for the Continental Army. I told them that they may do so as they please, but until it was decided by a court, I would not go out unless by force of bayonet, but only when I knew who had a right to do it, that then I should know how I should act. So demanding rights, right? Property rights, political rights. So these loyalist women, as much as patriot women, are learning these same lessons, are making these kinds of demands. Thousands of them. So what are we to make of all this? What is the legacy that comes out of this war for women? They'll come out with this growing sense that they have a right to equality. It doesn't mean they'll immediately get it, but they start to do things they were never able to do before. In the first half of the 19th century, women begin forming public organizations. Organizations mostly aimed at reforming American society. Asylum reform, orphanage reform, education reform, temperance movements. Musical reform, right? But temperance movements. Also abolitionist movement, right? All of these would be staffed by women, acting outside of the homes, raising money, raising awareness, doing real work in order to free people. And it was in the midst of doing that many of these women called for a conference at Seneca Falls in 1848 to demand a women's rights movement. And what do they do there? But they start by drafting a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, where they take the Declaration of Independence and rewrite it as a declaration of women's independence against patriarchy. That was a powerful moment. It takes another 70 years to get the right to vote. Here we are 106 years later, and political equality still isn't here. Right? Have you looked at the Senate? Have you looked at the House of Representatives? Have you looked at the Pennsylvania House and the Pennsylvania Senate? Are half of them women? Not even close. Right? So that's still not political equality. Women are still making 80 cents on the dollar compared to men for similar education, similar jobs, similar training. That equality still isn't here. You know what's going to bring it about? The fight for natural rights. This commitment to democracy and to using your power to demand from power that it change and that it give you what you deserve. Frederick Douglass said very convincingly in the 1850s, power concedes nothing without a demand. It's only with democracy that you can make that demand. And you have a duty that's given to you by these women to continue this struggle. The struggle to maintain your democracy 250 years later that is under assault everywhere and every day. It is your duty to do that. And it's your duty to do it for yourself and for your families. And you men, it's your duty to do it for your women. And you women, it's your duty to do it for your men. So if you take nothing away from this, that's the thing I want you to hold on to. And it's women who played a powerful role in creating this, our American identity. So, with that, I'll turn it over to questions, comments, flattery, and or insults. Repeat the question, I will. Any questions? Flattery would be nice too, but questions I'll take. Yes, Deb.
There's a great book that just came out on this subject, We the Women, by Nora O'Donnell.
Yes.
I just started listening to it. It's awesome. It is chapter 20 more.
Nora O'Donnell, We the Women. I'm not familiar with it yet. I haven't read it yet, but I'll take your word for it.
It's chapter by chapter, like she lists a number of the women that you were talking about.
I would also suggest, if you're interested in women in the military story, there's a book called Belonging to the Army. It was written by a professor at where Joe went to grad school, at Duquesne. Polly Mayer is her name. Great book that deals with all the various roles that women had in the Army. Another good book that's a general history of American women's history was written by Sarah Evans, and it's called Born for Liberty. She took the line from Sentiments of American Women that I read to you a minute ago. That does a wonderful job talking about the 1760s and the American Revolution. And there are questions, comments? Yes?
I've always had a problem with George Washington. Now I have more of a problem. How do you feel about George Washington?
Okay. She says she's had a problem with George Washington and how I feel about him. I don't feel anything about him one way or another. He's been dead a long time. But you know, it's some things about George Washington. I mean, he's a complicated man of his times, right? And there are a lot of complications. In terms of his military career, it starts out as a disaster in the French and Indian War. I mean, one absolute disaster after another. When he gets in the Revolution, he makes it very plain when they ask him to take over the army. He says, wait a minute, there's better people for this than me. And they were right? There were better people. But he gets stuck with it. And what he does is he learns that the thing he has to do during the Revolution is not get captured, to keep his army fighting. And so he teaches himself how to retreat and how to do it well and effectively, which sounds like cowardice, but it's not, right? It's a hard business, learning how to move an army and to keep from being captured. So militarily, I respect the guy in the Revolution. When it comes to his wife, she comes to Valley Forge, but she was no camp follower. Right? Martha didn't do any laundry. She didn't do any cooking. She lived in the house with him, right? So none of that happened there. They had an interesting marriage and relationship. She was more wealthy than he was, brought more enslaved people in their marriage. Now, Washington's the guy. Here's something. He's a slave owner, first president. He owned slaves. He had a slave. He brought his slaves to Philadelphia with him when he was president. One of them, a woman, Oni Judge, ran away to freedom. He spent the next 6 years of his life, the last 6 years of his life, trying to get her back, and never did. But then on his deathbed, he freed all of his slaves. And Oni Judge would have been one of them. This guy says, well, which is it, dude? Right? Now, when he freed all of his slaves, the ones that he brought into the marriage, which were only 1/3 of the 300 that he and his wife owned. And she didn't free a single one, right? So I feel a little more affinity for George than I do for Martha. Right? So, yes?
What percent of the musical Hamilton is historically correct?
Oh, good Lord. Alexander Hamilton was no Democrat, despite what they try to project. At the Constitutional Convention, he gets up and gives a speech that goes on for 6 hours that says that the United States should have a king and not a president. Right? When, as Secretary of the Treasury in the first two Washington administrations, he is ruthless in his pursuit of dragging money out of Americans, right, in tax money, in order to redistribute that to people who had speculated during the American Revolution, speculated in paper currency, speculated in land, speculated. And there's people like himself and people like General Washington who had been those speculators. That's what leads to your whiskey rebellion, right? That's what that's about, right? So, not a whole lot. Wonderful musical, right? Absolutely wonderful, right? But terrible history. Any other questions? Maybe about women? Yes?
I was going to say, is this the wider approach you were kind of hoping I would go with for my Rosie and the Nurse paper? Is this how you guys understand it?
This is my student, Arden Hetrick. Autumn is asking about a paper that she wrote. This is not the time or the place to make me do my job. But yes, absolutely, right? To have this broader perspective, right, about the role of women. So she wrote a paper for me about women during World War II, right? Rosie the Riveter, right? We know about that. So this is one of those things that people assume that women never worked outside the home before World War II, that somehow or another created that. That is baloney, right? Because prior to World War II, working class women, poor women, always worked and always outside the home. Well over half of all American women were constantly working. It was upper class women and middle class women that started to join them during World War II. And they are a small, thin section of the people at that time. There were people like my grandmother, right? My dad's mom was born to a sharecropping family in Southern Virginia on a tobacco plantation. They were about as poor as you can imagine. My grandmother only got one pair of shoes a year. She got them when school started. If she outgrew them, then she didn't have any, right? Just really, really dirt poor. During the 30s, the Great Depression, she got poorer, right? In the late 30s, she and her husband moved to Newport News, and he got work in a shipyard, building ships. We were about to go into World War II. The war started in Europe, right? We started building ships like crazy. He got a job as a metal worker. She went in and got a job as a secretary, right? Working in the office, because she had a high school diploma, right? She could type a little bit. He went off to war in 42, right? By 43, they didn't have enough people working in the yard. My grandmother moved from the office into the shipyard, and they gave her a rivet gun, right? And she did that for 2 years until the end of the war. And that transformed her life. She had been working from the time that she started picking tobacco and working on tobacco plantation when she was about 5 years old. Coming out of the war, she was in her mid-30s, and it was this work that got her a job with the federal government. And she moved the family from Virginia to Washington, D.C. My grandfather comes home from the war, can't find work, right? He comes a handyman, what have you, right? But she, through this experience, drags her family out of poverty. They rent a house in Gaithersburg, Maryland. She ends up buying the house. My grandfather didn't get a full-time job until about 1949, 1950. There was a depression after the war. I don't know if you realize that, right? But she was working for the government, had a great paycheck, sustained that family because of the work that drove her out of poverty. It wasn't that she wasn't working before the war. It's that there are opportunities. That's what I was trying to say. Yes?
Did Patience Wright actually spy for the colonies?
Did she spy for the colonies? Yes, there were many American women that were involved in the spying, right? And it started before the war. So you might have heard of Paul Revere, right? There were these midnight riders in Boston who agreed that if the British were going to move out of Boston into Massachusetts, that they would ride out in various directions and warn people. Well, yeah, there were men who were those riders, but there were women within the city, right, who were part of this movement in order to gauge what was happening, what the British Army was doing, and passing on information to these men. So women throughout the war were involved in gaining information and then passing that information on.
Was there a specific 16-year-old that was like the daughter of one of the guys that also did the same ride that Paul Revere did?
Yeah, there is. You're exactly right. I can't remember her name either. But it wasn't it wasn't in Boston. It was later. Now, this was later. So there is a famous 16-year-old girl who goes on this 40-mile ride to make a warning that the British were coming to a particular community. I can't for the life of me remember her name or where it was, but you are right about that. So there's more of these things. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface with this talk. Yes?
Are there any opportunities for women in the coverture framework, say if they're like a widow and their husband dies?
Yes. Yes. That's the only way. All the men have to be dead, right? And it does happen. Now, when that happens, those women, they are threatening to the patriarchal order. So if you look in the 17th century, there's a lot of witchcraft trials going on in Massachusetts, Connecticut, right throughout New England. You know the thing that defines the one characteristic that ties together most of the women who are accused of witchcraft? There were women who owned property who had no men to dispense that property. Now, in New England, when you made the accusation of witchcraft, if the person was found guilty, the accuser got the property. Right. Right, so this was the number one. So as we get into the 18th century, you know, you head through the Enlightenment, witchcraft kind of dies down. It like almost disappears in America, although sometimes it'll pop up here and there, witchcraft trials in the 18th century, but nothing like the 17th century. But by the middle of the 18th century, you do start seeing women who are running taverns and inns with their husbands, and their husbands die, and they keep their husband's tavern license and keep operating these taverns. Really kind of interesting, something I could have talked about here. So in the run-up to the Revolution, when the Sons of Liberty form, they are working class guys who are in cities up and down the seaboard, and they load and unload ships, they build ships, they make rope, they make sails, all this kind of stuff. They were part of a mutual benefit organization that existed in all the colonies called the Sons of Neptune. And they would pay dues into this, and out of the dues, if they got sick, they could collect some money. If they die, a benefit goes to their wives, money for their burial. Right, so it's a mutual benefit. It's an insurance company, but it's also a social club. It's these Sons of Neptune that become the Sons of Liberty. Where they meet is in taverns, bars, right, and inns. Who's running those taverns? Most times women. It's these women who work with these Sons of Liberty who then form the Daughters of Liberty out of these taverns. These Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty communicate with one another by letters, right, from resolutions that they make, going from tavern to tavern. Why do they do that? Because it's taverns that were the local post offices. There was no post office. Your mail got delivered to the local tavern. So you meet in the tavern, you come up with a resolution, you write it down, everybody would sign it, and you make copies of it, and you mail it off to other chapters of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and the news spreads. And that's very much how this resistance movement got going, right? Very organic, and women were a part of it. Yes? Yeah, you have a... Yeah.
So in your educated opinion.
That's funny. Yes?
Why don't we have a woman president yet in the United States?
Why do you think?
I just looked that up. There's been 50 women and that have been heads of state. And the list of countries is in Asia, Europe, Africa, and we are in India. We are so far behind on that point.
Well, I'll give you.
Why do you think?
Well, I feel like, we can get as many women behind us as we need, but that's only half the population. We need men.
Sure.
And so there are still women who, I want to say, love patriarchy. There are flatly, a million women who say a woman should.
Yes. There's a whole movement right now online of young women who are proclaiming that they have the right to give up this advancement and to move backward. Trad wives. Exactly. Hey, it's a free country and people can do what they want. No, seriously. I mean, I don't care how people live their lives or how they want to live their lives, right? But that is going on for sure. Yes, Val.
Because they mentioned there are a large number of other countries that have their behaviors. Scandinavia is their country. I know this is going to sound bad, and I don't mean to make it sound bad, but in our cultural diversity is working against us in having women become leaders. Because it's in countries that are more ethnically similar they accept that idea of women writers.
And there's more competition.
And there's more competition, but when we get our groups of individuals, the diversity of religions, diversity of ethnic groups, the diversity
Could
of
be.
everything, maybe that is holding us back from accepting all of that.
Yeah, we come close, and there's only been two, right, that have made it that far to run in 47. Well, yeah, but not major party nominated, right? 2 out of 47. I mean, that's the beginning, you know. So it's I think it's unfair, you know, to those candidates.
How long
Sure.
American women get recognized.
Sure.
And we were not the first ones.
Right.
There were other countries.
Sure, absolutely. Right. We weren't the first country to abolish slavery. We were the fourth. Right? So,
I'd like to make a plug for the American Association of University Women. This year, Pennsylvania is hosting the Atlantic Regional Conference, and the title of the conference is Unfinished Revolution. There is still an unfinished revolution for women. That's why we exist, and that's why we do what we do, advancing equity for women through research, education, and advocacy. That's our mission, and having all here tonight is part of that mission, part of that education. But it is an unfinished revolution, without a doubt.
well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out and being such a great audience. I really appreciate it. Oh, thank you very much. Have a great night.